In the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, where mist clings to ancient stones and whispers echo through empty halls, stands a castle that housed one of history's most terrifying secrets. For 30 years, young peasant girls entered its gates to serve nobility, but many never returned home. The mistress of this fortress, protected by laws that placed her above justice, would become synonymous with horror itself. Countess Elizabeth Báthory de Erzsébet, born into one of Hungary's most powerful families in 1560, wielded influence that extended far beyond her castle walls. In an era when feudal law granted nobles near absolute power over their serfs, she exploited every legal loophole that protected her class. The very system designed to maintain social order would enable what many historians consider the most prolific female serial killer in recorded history. The stories that emerge from Castle Čachtice defy comprehension. Witnesses spoke of torture chambers where young girls endured unimaginable suffering. They described instruments of pain, chambers of ice, and acts of brutality that pushed the boundaries of human cruelty. Most disturbing were accounts of bite marks on victims' bodies, suggesting a predator who literally consumed her prey's flesh in acts of symbolic cannibalism. For decades, the screams from the castle were silenced by fear and feudal law. Parents who lost daughters dared not speak against nobility. Local officials, bound by class loyalty and legal constraints, turned blind eyes to mounting evidence. The law that should have protected the innocent instead shielded a monster, creating a perfect storm of privilege and predation. What drove a woman of such wealth and status to commit acts that horrified even the brutal standards of her time? Was she truly the Blood Countess, who bathed in virgin blood to preserve her youth? Or was this legend crafted by enemies who coveted her vast estates? The line between historical fact and political propaganda blurs across 4 centuries, leaving us to piece together truth from testimony extracted under torture. In 1610, after 3 decades of whispered accusations, King Matthias II finally ordered an investigation that would shock the Hungarian court. What investigators found inside Castle Čachtice surpassed their darkest expectations. The testimonies they gathered painted a picture of systematic torture and murder on a scale that challenged belief. Yet even when faced with overwhelming evidence, the law that enabled her crimes also protected her from justice. While her accomplices faced torture and execution, the Countess herself was never formally tried. Her noble blood proved thicker than the blood of her victims, and she was merely confined to her castle until death claimed her 4 years later. This is the story of how feudal law created a perfect predator, how social hierarchy enabled systematic horror, and how one woman's name became forever linked with darkness. It's a tale that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the price paid by those society deems expendable. Elizabeth Báthory's Hungary was a land torn between empires, where Ottoman Turks pressed from the south and Habsburg influence encroached from the west. The Kingdom of Hungary, in the late 16th century, existed in a state of perpetual warfare, creating a society where violence was normalized and human life held different values depending on one's birth. This was the world that shaped the woman who would become the Blood Countess. The Báthory family stood among the most influential dynasties in Eastern Europe. They had produced kings, princes, and war heroes who defended Christianity against Ottoman expansion. Elizabeth's uncle, Stephen Báthory, ruled as King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Her family controlled vast territories, commanded private armies, and moved in circles where power was absolute and accountability virtually non-existent. Born in 1560 at the family seat in Eyerbator, Elizabeth entered a world where her elevated status was never questioned. The feudal system that governed Hungarian society created rigid hierarchies where nobles possessed rights that would seem tyrannical by modern standards. They could administer justice on their lands, including capital punishment, without oversight from royal courts. Serfs were property in all but name, bound to the land and subject to their lord's whims. Elizabeth's childhood coincided with some of Hungary's darkest hours. The Battle of Mohacs in 1526 had shattered Hungarian independence, dividing the kingdom into three parts. The central region fell under Ottoman control. The west became part of the Habsburg domain, and only Transylvania maintained semi-independence under Hungarian princes. This fragmentation weakened central authority and strengthened local nobles who became laws unto themselves. The young Elizabeth received an education exceptional for women of her era. She spoke Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek fluently. Contemporary accounts describe her as intelligent, charismatic, and deeply aware of her privileged position. At age 11, she was engaged to Ferenc Nadasdy, scion of another powerful family, in a political alliance that would unite two of Hungary's greatest fortunes. The society Elizabeth inhabited was one of extreme contrasts. While nobles lived in luxury, discussing philosophy and commissioning art, peasants endured conditions barely above slavery. The Turkish wars had devastated the countryside, creating waves of orphans and displaced families. Young peasant girls often sought employment in noble households as their only escape from starvation. This desperation created a steady supply of vulnerable victims for those inclined to abuse their power. Religious turmoil added another layer of complexity to this violent era. The Protestant Reformation had swept through Hungary, dividing families and communities. Elizabeth's family included both Catholic and Protestant members, reflecting the religious tensions that characterized the period. Some historians suggest religious conflicts may have played a role in her eventual downfall, as Catholic Habsburgs sought to weaken Protestant Hungarian nobles. The legal framework of feudal Hungary created an environment where noble crimes against commoners rarely faced punishment. The concept of high justice gave lords the right to execute serfs for various offenses. While technically subject to royal authority, nobles in practice operated with near-complete autonomy on their estates. This system, designed to maintain order in a decentralized kingdom, instead enabled systematic abuse by those powerful enough to exploit it. Elizabeth married Ferenc Nadasdy in 1575, when she was 15 and he was 20. Known as the Black Knight of Hungary for his brutality against Turkish forces, Ferenc was often absent on military campaigns. These absences left Elizabeth as the sole authority over their vast estates, including Castle Čachtice and later Castle Čachtice. Contemporary sources suggest that Ferenc was aware of his wife's cruel tendencies, but either approved or felt powerless to intervene. The marriage produced 5 children, who survived to adulthood, suggesting that Elizabeth could maintain a facade of normalcy when necessary. Court records and correspondence from this period paint a picture of a competent estate manager who expanded the family's wealth and influence. She administered justice in local disputes, managed complex financial affairs, and navigated the treacherous politics of a divided kingdom. Yet beneath this veneer of noble respectability, disturbing patterns were emerging. Servants at the Nadasdy estates began whispering about the Countess's treatment of young female staff. Girls who entered her service often disappeared, explained away as runaways or victims of the ever-present Turkish raids. Local priests noticed the unusually high number of servant girls buried in churchyards near Báthory residences. Ferenc Nadasdy died in 1604, possibly from an infected wound sustained in battle. His death removed the last restraint on Elizabeth's behavior. As a widow, she possessed even greater autonomy under Hungarian law. She controlled one of the kingdom's largest fortunes, commanded the loyalty of hundreds of retainers, and answered to no husband or male guardian. The stage was set for an escalation in violence that would shock even a society inured to brutality. The castle at Čachtice, perched on a limestone cliff overlooking the Little Carpathians, became Elizabeth's primary residence after her husband's death. Its remote location, formidable defenses, and distance from royal oversight made it an ideal setting for activities that required secrecy. The fortress had been in the Báthory family for generations, its stones witnesses to centuries of power and privilege. Contemporary accounts describe Castle Čachtice as a place of dread among local peasants. Parents warned daughters against accepting positions there, even as poverty made such warnings difficult to heed. The castle's isolation meant that what happened within its walls remained hidden from outside scrutiny. In an age before modern communications, a remote fortress could become a world unto itself, governed only by its master's desires. The societal structure that enabled Elizabeth's alleged crimes reflected broader patterns of abuse throughout feudal Europe. Noble privilege created spaces where law ceased to function, where power became its own justification. The Countess Báthory was not unique in exploiting these systems. She was simply the most extreme example of what happened when sadistic personality met unchecked authority. This historical context is crucial for understanding how someone could allegedly torture and kill for decades without intervention. Elizabeth Báthory was not operating in a vacuum, but within a system that prioritized noble privilege over human life. The laws meant to organize society instead created perfect conditions for a predator who understood exactly how far her protection extended. The methods attributed to Countess Báthory reveal a mind that transformed cruelty into art. According to testimonies gathered during the 1610 investigation, her torture techniques evolved from simple beatings to elaborate rituals of pain that could last for weeks. Each method seemed designed not just to hurt, but to explore the boundaries of human suffering while maintaining the victim's consciousness for as long as possible. The castle's design facilitated these horrors. Witnesses described a ground-floor chamber equipped with iron implements, ropes, and chains. The stone walls, they said, bore stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove. In winter, victims were stripped naked and doused with water, then forced outside to freeze to death in the castle courtyard. Their frozen corpses served as warnings to other servants who might consider disobedience or escape. One of the most frequently mentioned torture devices was a cylindrical cage lined with spikes, too narrow for the victim to sit or crouch. Girls were locked inside while the cage was hoisted above the floor, their own body weight driving the spikes deeper with each involuntary movement. The Countess allegedly watched these sessions with the detached interest of a natural philosopher, observing an experiment. The testimonies speak of heated iron tools applied to sensitive areas, needles driven under fingernails and toenails, and flesh torn with specially designed pincers. Some accounts describe a spiked throne where victims were forced to sit while hot coals were placed beneath the seat. The variety and sophistication of these methods suggests someone who had given considerable thought to the mechanics of pain. Perhaps most disturbing were the accounts of cannibalistic behavior. Multiple witnesses testified to seeing bite marks on victims' bodies, particularly on faces, shoulders, and breasts. Some claimed the Countess would bite chunks of flesh from living victims during torture sessions. Whether driven by sadistic pleasure or some deeper psychological compulsion, these acts crossed boundaries that horrified even hardened investigators. The selection of victims followed clear patterns. Young peasant girls between the ages of 10 and 16 were preferred, particularly those with no strong family connections. Orphans, daughters of impoverished widows, and girls from distant villages made ideal targets. They were lured with promises of positions as chambermaids or seamstresses, legitimate opportunities that desperate families could hardly refuse. Once inside the castle, escape became nearly impossible. The fortress's cliff-top location and heavily guarded gates trapped victims as effectively as any dungeon. Those who attempted to flee were hunted down by the Countess's loyal retainers and returned for especially severe punishment. The castle operated as a closed system where the normal rules of society ceased to apply. The complicity of Báthory's inner circle reveals how systemic such abuse had become. Her closest accomplices included Dorothea Sentes, known as Dorka, an older woman who allegedly instructed the Countess in torture techniques. János Újvári, called Fichko, was said to be particularly skilled at devising new implements of pain. These individuals formed a small court of cruelty, each playing specific roles in the torture and disposal of victims. The infamous bloodbaths that gave Elizabeth her posthumous title remain the most controversial aspect of her legend. According to some accounts, she believed that bathing in virgin blood would preserve her youth and beauty. Witnesses described seeing the Countess emerge from such baths with an almost euphoric expression. However, many historians question whether these stories were later embellishments added to an already horrific narrative. What seems clear from contemporary evidence is that blood played a significant role in Báthory's activities. Whether for cosmetic purposes or sadistic pleasure, she allegedly had servants collect blood from tortured victims in special vessels. Some testimonies describe rituals where blood was applied to her skin or consumed in small quantities. These acts, whether real or imagined, contributed to her transformation from historical figure to legendary monster. The escalation of violence over time suggests an addiction to cruelty that required ever greater stimulation. Early in her widowhood, beatings and minor tortures apparently sufficed. As years passed, the methods became more elaborate, the sessions longer, and the number of victims increased. Like any addiction, the need for more intense experiences drove increasingly risky behavior. This progression eventually led to Báthory's downfall. As her victim count rose, maintaining secrecy became impossible. Bodies had to be disposed of, families asked questions, and even loyal servants began to balk at the scale of killing. The very elaborateness that fed her compulsion also created evidence that would eventually break through the protective barrier of noble privilege. The systematic nature of these crimes speaks to a level of organization that goes beyond impulsive sadism. Victims were procured through established networks, torture sessions followed predictable patterns, and bodies were disposed of using tested methods. This was not random violence, but a carefully managed operation that functioned for decades. Understanding these methods matters not for their sensational value, but for what they reveal about the intersection of power and pathology. The tortures attributed to Báthory were not unique in their cruelty. Similar methods were used in judicial proceedings throughout Europe. What made them exceptional was their application for personal gratification rather than state purposes, and their use against innocents rather than convicted criminals. The physical evidence of these crimes would have been overwhelming in any other context. Bones discovered in castle grounds, blood-stained chambers, and torture implements all pointed to systematic killing. Yet for 30 years, this evidence was ignored or explained away. The methods of murder were less shocking to contemporary authorities than the challenge they posed to social hierarchy. These detailed accounts of torture serve as more than historical curiosities. They demonstrate how unchecked power can manifest in G1 cruelty, how systemic inequality creates perfect victims, and how even the most horrific crimes can be normalized within certain social contexts. The methods matter because they reveal the methodical nature of evil when it operates without restraint. The first documented victim whose name survives to history was a 12-year-old girl named Ilona Harczy. According to testimony given by Elizabeth's laundress, Ilona was beaten so severely that her body had to be hidden until the wounds healed enough to make her death appear natural. This pattern of concealment would continue for decades, with each successful cover-up emboldening the Countess to greater extremes. Court records from 1602 mention a complaint filed by the Reverend Janos Ponikenus regarding the death of a young woman in Báthory's service. The girl had been buried hastily without proper rites, arousing the priest's suspicion. When he inquired, he was told she had died suddenly of disease. His formal complaint to church authorities was dismissed after intervention from powerful Báthory allies. This early warning sign was ignored, setting a precedent for official indifference. The testimony of Susanna Varga, collected during the 1610 investigation, provides one of the most detailed eyewitness accounts. A seamstress who worked in the castle for 3 years, Susanna described seeing dozens of girls tortured and killed. She recalled one victim, a 14-year-old named Anna Davulia, who endured 2 weeks of escalating torture before finally succumbing. Susanna's decision to remain silent for so long reflects the impossible position of servants who witnessed these crimes. Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from a survivor named Katarina Benica. One of the few victims to escape the castle alive, she bore permanent scars from her ordeal. Katerina described being held in a cellar with 5 other girls, watching as they were taken one by one for torture sessions from which they never returned. Her escape during a winter storm was nothing short of miraculous, and her testimony would prove crucial in building the case against Báthory. The families of victims faced an agonizing dilemma. Accusing a noble of murder was itself dangerous, potentially resulting in punishment for slander. Many chose to accept the official explanations for their daughters' disappearances rather than risk retribution. Those who did speak out found their concerns dismissed by authorities unwilling to challenge the Báthory family's power. One particularly tragic case involved the Sabo family, minor nobles who had sent their daughter Erzsébet to serve at Castle Čachtice as a companion to the Countess. When they grew concerned about her silence and requested to visit, they were told she had run away with a soldier. Months later, a servant secretly informed them that Erzsébet had been tortured to death for accidentally breaking a mirror. Their attempts to seek justice were blocked at every level of the judicial system. The complicity of local officials becomes clear in the testimony of Benedict de Seo, a castle notary who maintained records of household expenses. He admitted to falsifying death certificates, listing causes as plague or accidents rather than violence. His meticulous records, seized during the investigation, showed payments for lime to dissolve bodies and bribes to officials who asked inconvenient questions. The role of the Countess's noble accomplices extended beyond the castle walls. Several testimonies implicated members of the minor nobility in procuring victims. These individuals would identify suitable girls in distant villages, arrange for their transport to the castle, and ensure that families who asked questions were silenced through bribes or threats. This network demonstrates how noble privilege created systems of exploitation that extended throughout society. Medical testimony provided during the investigation offers glimpses into the physical evidence of these crimes. A surgeon named Benedict Báthory examined several exhumed bodies and documented injuries consistent with prolonged torture. His detailed reports describe broken bones, evidence of burning, and wounds that could only have been inflicted deliberately over extended periods. This scientific approach to documenting violence was unusual for the era and strengthens the credibility of witness accounts. The testimonies also reveal the psychological manipulation used to control victims and accomplices alike. New servants were gradually introduced to violence, first as witnesses, then as unwilling participants. This grooming process created a hierarchy of complicity where each person knew enough to be blackmailed, but not enough to fully understand the scale of the crimes. Fear and coercion bound this community of silence together. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a letter written by the Countess herself, discovered hidden in her chambers. In it, she discussed arrangements for disposing of useless servants and mentioned specific torture sessions with disturbing casualness. The authenticity of this letter has been debated by historians, but its discovery during the initial investigation influenced contemporary opinion about her guilt. The sheer number of victims remains disputed. During the trial of her accomplices, one witness claimed to have seen a list in the Countess's handwriting documenting 650 victims. Others testified to personally witnessing the deaths of 50 to 80 girls. Even the most conservative estimates suggest dozens of murders, while some accounts place the number in the hundreds. The exact count may never be known, as many early victims were likely disposed of without any record. The testimonies paint a picture of escalating boldness. Initially, victims were exclusively from the servant class, their deaths easily explained as accidents or disease. As years passed without consequence, the Countess allegedly began targeting daughters of minor gentry who had been sent to her for education in noble manners. This expansion of victim selection ultimately contributed to her downfall, as noble families had more resources to demand investigations. The geographic spread of victims tells its own story. Girls were recruited from an ever-widening circle around Castle Čachtice as local villages learned to keep their daughters away. By 1609, procurers were traveling to distant regions of Hungary to find suitable victims, offering generous payments to desperate families. This expansion of operations required more accomplices and created more opportunities for exposure. These documented cases represent only a fraction of the horror that unfolded within Castle Čachtice. For every victim whose name survives in court records, many others disappeared without trace. Their stories, preserved in the testimony of witnesses who finally found the courage to speak, serve as monuments to lives cut short by the collision of sadistic personality and unchecked power. The investigation that finally brought scrutiny to Castle Čachtice began not from concern for murdered peasants, but from political and financial motivations that made Elizabeth Báthory vulnerable. By 1610, she'd become one of the wealthiest individuals in Hungary, holding massive debts from the crown itself. King Matthias II owed her late husband's estate a fortune for financing military campaigns against the Turks. Her downfall would conveniently erase these royal debts. The appointment of György Thurzó as Palatine of Hungary in 1609 marked a turning point. Thurzó, despite being Báthory's cousin through marriage, faced pressure from both the Habsburg court and Hungarian nobles concerned about her growing power. The rumors of atrocities at Čachtice provided the perfect pretext for action against someone who had become too powerful, too wealthy, and too independent for comfort. On December 29, 1610, Thurzó led a raid on Castle Čachtice that would become legendary in Hungarian history. His party allegedly discovered a scene of active horror: a dead girl in the main hall, another dying victim nearby, and several others locked in cells showing signs of torture. While some historians question whether this dramatic discovery was staged for effect, the raid provided undeniable evidence of systematic killing. The immediate aftermath of the raid revealed the complex interplay of law and noble privilege. Despite overwhelming evidence, Thurzó did not arrest the Countess. Instead, he negotiated with her family to avoid a public trial that would disgrace one of Hungary's most prominent dynasties. This arrangement, house arrest rather than formal prosecution, demonstrates how even in extremity, noble blood provided protection unavailable to common criminals. The trial that followed focused not on Báthory herself, but on her four main accomplices: Dorothea Szentes, Ilona Jó, János Ujvári, and Katarina Benica. These commoners could be prosecuted without challenging the fundamental structure of noble privilege. Their testimonies, extracted under torture, provided lurid details that satisfied public curiosity while protecting the system that enabled such crimes. The legal proceedings revealed the Austrian-Hungarian authorities' primary concerns. Questions focused as much on property rights and financial obligations as on murder. Investigators carefully documented the Báthory estate's assets, suggesting that financial considerations played a significant role in pursuing the case. The massive debts owed by the crown to the Báthory family disappeared, along with Elizabeth's freedom. The sentences handed down to Báthory's accomplices reflected standard judicial brutality of the era. Dorothea Szentes and Ilona Jó, identified as primary organizers of torture sessions, were condemned to have their fingers torn out with hot pincers before being burned alive. János Ujvári, as a younger participant allegedly coerced into participation, was beheaded before burning. Only Katarina Benica, whose testimony proved crucial and who was deemed less culpable, received a prison sentence. The Countess herself remained in legal limbo. Technically never tried or convicted, she was confined to Castle Čachtice by family agreement rather than judicial sentence. This extrajudicial solution preserved noble dignity while effectively removing her from power. Her children retained their inheritance and titles, avoiding the complete destruction that would have followed a formal conviction for such crimes. The political ramifications extended beyond Hungary's borders. The Habsburg court used the scandal to weaken Hungarian noble autonomy, arguing that such atrocities proved the need for stronger central authority. Protestant nobles saw the prosecution as part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation's assault on their power. These broader conflicts transformed a criminal case into a political battlefield, where justice for victims became secondary to larger power struggles. Legal scholars of the period debated whether noble privilege should extend to such extreme crimes. Some argued that Báthory's actions fell outside any reasonable interpretation of feudal rights. Others maintained that trying a noble for crimes against servants would undermine the entire social order. These debates, preserved in contemporary correspondence, show how the case challenged fundamental assumptions about law and hierarchy. The limited nature of the investigation raises troubling questions. Authorities showed little interest in identifying all victims or providing justice for their families. The focus remained on spectacular crimes rather than systematic investigation. Many potential witnesses were never interviewed, and vast amounts of evidence were likely destroyed by family members protecting the Báthory reputation. International reaction to the case varied considerably. In Western Europe, pamphlets describing Báthory's crimes sold widely, feeding public fascination with exotic Hungarian brutality. The Ottoman Empire, engaged in constant conflict with Hungary, used the scandal as propaganda, demonstrating Christian moral corruption. These external perspectives shaped how the case was remembered and mythologized. The immediate consequence for Castle Čachtice's surrounding communities was mixed. While the reign of terror had ended, economic disruption followed. The castle had been a major employer and market for local goods. Its closure threw many into poverty, creating new vulnerabilities for the same populations that had supplied victims. This economic aftermath demonstrates how deeply embedded such exploitation was in the social fabric. The Báthory family's response to the scandal reveals noble solidarity transcending individual crimes. Rather than disowning Elizabeth, her relatives worked to minimize damage to the family name. They destroyed documents, intimidated witnesses, and crafted alternative narratives that portrayed her as mentally ill rather than evil. This collective effort to preserve reputation over pursuing justice speaks to the priorities of aristocratic society. The legacy of the investigation extends beyond its immediate outcomes. It established precedents for prosecuting noble crimes, however limited. The detailed testimonies collected during the proceedings provide invaluable historical documentation of life in feudal Hungary. Most importantly, it demonstrated that even the most powerful individuals could face some form of consequence when their crimes became too egregious to ignore. 4 centuries later, the legal questions raised by the Báthory case remain relevant. How does society balance individual rights with collective power? When does privilege become impunity? These fundamental issues of justice and authority continue to resonate in modern legal systems, making this historical case study more than mere sensationalism. The immediate aftermath of Elizabeth Báthory's confinement saw efforts to contain the scandal's damage to noble prestige. Her family worked systematically to destroy evidence, silence witnesses, and craft alternative narratives that portrayed her as a victim of political persecution or mental illness. These efforts partially succeeded, creating historical ambiguities that persist today. Castle Čachtice itself became a monument to horror. Local peasants refused to approach its walls, believing it cursed by the souls of tortured victims. The Báthory family abandoned it as a residence, leaving it to decay. Within a generation, it had become a ruin, its stones pilfered by locals who whispered prayers while dismantling the site of so much suffering. The impact on Hungarian noble society was profound, if subtle. While no formal laws changed, the Báthory scandal created unspoken limitations on noble behavior. The case demonstrated that even the highest-born could face consequences if their crimes became too public and politically inconvenient. This recognition led to more discreet exercises of power, not necessarily more humane ones. The Protestant-Catholic divide in Hungary found new fuel in the scandal. Catholic propagandists portrayed Báthory's crimes as the natural result of Protestant heresy, while Protestants argued that Catholic authorities had enabled her through corruption and indifference. These religious interpretations of the case influenced Hungarian politics for decades, contributing to ongoing sectarian tensions. Legal reforms in the decades following the scandal showed indirect influence from the case. New regulations required better documentation of servant deaths and established limited oversight of noble estates. While these measures fell far short of protecting vulnerable populations, they represented acknowledgement that completely unchecked power could threaten social stability. The economic consequences rippled through the region for generations. The Báthory estates, once among Hungary's most prosperous, fragmented through legal disputes and mismanagement. Villages that had supplied servants to the castle faced lasting stigma. The regional economy, disrupted by the scandal and subsequent abandonment of the castle, took decades to recover. Literary and cultural responses began almost immediately. Pamphlets describing Báthory's crimes circulated throughout Europe, each retelling adding new embellishments. By the 18th century, she had become a stock character in Gothic literature, her historical reality obscured by layers of fiction. This transformation from person to archetype demonstrates how trauma becomes mythology over time. The feminist interpretation of Báthory's story emerged centuries later, questioning whether her crimes were exaggerated because of her gender and power. Some scholars argue that male nobles who committed similar atrocities faced less scrutiny or punishment. While not excusing her crimes, this perspective highlights how gender influenced both the original events and their historical interpretation. The vampire legend that eventually attached to Báthory represents the most dramatic transformation of her legacy. The blood-bathing stories, likely fictional embellishments, evolved into tales of literal vampirism. By the 19th century, she had become the Blood Countess, inspiring countless horror stories that bore little resemblance to historical reality. Modern Hungarian national identity grapples uncomfortably with the Báthory legacy. She remains simultaneously a source of dark fascination and national embarrassment. Tourist sites connected to her story generate revenue while raising ethical questions about commercializing tragedy. This tension reflects broader challenges in how societies remember and profit from historical horrors. The psychological impact on descendant communities persists in subtle ways. Families whose ancestors served at Castle Čachtice often carry generational trauma, expressed through folklore and cautionary tales. These oral traditions preserve memories that official histories overlooked, maintaining victim perspectives alongside the more documented noble narrative. Scientific interest in the case has produced various psychological theories about Báthory's motivations. Modern analysts have proposed diagnoses ranging from sadistic personality disorder to psychopathy shaped by childhood trauma. While such retrospective analysis has limitations, it demonstrates ongoing efforts to understand how extreme cruelty develops and operates. The legal precedents established by the case influenced subsequent Hungarian jurisprudence in complex ways. While it didn't end noble privilege, it created recognition that such privilege had limits. Later cases involving noble crimes often reference the Báthory affair as a boundary marker for acceptable aristocratic behavior. The preservation efforts at Castle Čachtice reflect changing attitudes toward dark heritage sites. Modern restoration work balances historical preservation with respect for victims. Interpretive materials attempt to honor the murdered, while explaining the historical context that enabled such crimes. This delicate balance demonstrates evolving approaches to traumatic history. The Báthory case's influence on modern true crime narratives is substantial. Her story established templates for how society discusses female serial killers, the intersection of privilege and crime, and the challenge of separating fact from legend in historical cases. These narrative patterns continue to shape how contemporary crimes are understood and discussed. Contemporary relevance emerges in discussions of power, privilege, and justice. The mechanisms that protected Báthory, wealth, social position, institutional complicity, remain operational in different forms today. Her case serves as a historical mirror for examining how modern societies enable or prevent exploitation by the powerful. Educational approaches to the Báthory story vary considerably across cultures and contexts. Some focus on the sensational aspects, using horror to engage student interest. Others emphasize systemic analysis, examining how social structures enable individual cruelty. These different pedagogical choices reflect ongoing debates about how to teach traumatic history. The question of memorial and memory remains contentious. Unlike victims of state-sponsored violence, Báthory's victims have no official memorial. Efforts to establish recognition for these murdered girls face obstacles from those who prefer to forget or mythologize rather than commemorate. This absence speaks to whose lives society deems worthy of formal remembrance. The transformation of Elizabeth Báthory from historical figure to cultural icon demonstrates how societies process trauma through storytelling. Each generation has reimagined her story to reflect contemporary anxieties about power, gender, and violence. This ongoing evolution ensures her legacy remains dynamic, continually reinterpreted rather than fixed in historical amber. The tale of Countess Elizabeth Báthory stands as one of history's darkest chapters, a testament to what happens when sadistic personality meets unchecked power. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the systems we create to organize society. 4 centuries later, the questions raised by her crimes remain disturbingly relevant. What enabled a woman to allegedly torture and murder for 30 years without intervention? The answer lies not in individual evil alone, but in the systematic failures of a society that valued noble privilege over human life. Every institution that should have protected the vulnerable instead shielded their predator. Law, religion, and social custom all bent to accommodate power rather than serve justice. The victims of Castle Čachtice, mostly young peasant girls whose names history barely preserved, paid the ultimate price for their society's inequalities. They died not just from individual cruelty, but from a system that deemed their lives expendable. Their suffering stands as an indictment of any society that creates categories of people whose humanity matters less than others' privilege. Yet the eventual investigation, however flawed and politically motivated, demonstrates that even the most entrenched power has limits. When Báthory's crimes became too egregious, too public, and too politically useful to ignore, the system that protected her finally acted. This delayed justice offers both hope and warning. Hope that no power is truly absolute, warning about how much suffering occurs before boundaries are enforced. The mythologization of Elizabeth Báthory reveals how societies process collective trauma. By transforming her into a vampire, a monster, a figure of supernatural evil, we distance ourselves from the human systems that created her. It's comforting to believe such horror requires inhuman evil, rather than recognizing how ordinary social structures can enable extraordinary cruelty. Modern parallels emerge uncomfortably often. When we see powerful individuals escape consequences for exploitation, when institutions protect predators rather than victims, when wealth and status create immunity from justice, we witness the same dynamics that operated at Castle Čachtice. The specific forms change, but the fundamental patterns persist. The question of Elizabeth Báthory's guilt remains historically complex. While the evidence strongly suggests systematic murder, it was gathered through torture and served political purposes. We must acknowledge this ambiguity while not losing sight of the documented suffering. Whether she killed 50 or 650, whether she bathed in blood or merely tortured for pleasure, the core horror remains unchanged. Her story ultimately transcends the individual to illuminate systemic failures. A society that grants unchecked power to any group creates opportunities for such abuse. The specific manifestation may vary, whether feudal lords over serfs or modern systems of exploitation, but the fundamental danger remains constant. Power without accountability corrupts, and absolute power enables absolute corruption. The servants who finally testified against Báthory showed extraordinary courage. Speaking truth to power in any era risks retaliation, but in feudal Hungary it could mean death. Their willingness to break silence, even when authorities showed more interest in politics than justice, deserves recognition. They remind us that exposing abuse requires individual bravery when systems fail. Historical distance should not diminish our horror at these events. The young girls tortured at Castle Čachtice experienced real agony, felt real terror, died real deaths. They were not props in a Gothic tale, but human beings whose lives were cut short by cruelty, enabled by indifference. Remembering them as people rather than statistics honors their memory. The legal aftermath of the case offers its own lessons. By punishing only commoner accomplices while protecting noble privilege, authorities demonstrated that justice served power rather than truth. This selective prosecution protected the system while appearing to address its failures. Such performative justice that maintains underlying inequities remains a contemporary challenge. Modern tourism at Báthory-related sites raises ethical questions about commercializing tragedy. When historical horror becomes entertainment, we risk losing sight of real suffering. Yet these sites also serve educational purposes, helping visitors understand how such events occurred. Balancing commemoration with exploitation requires constant vigilance and respect for victims. The feminist analysis of Báthory's case provides important perspective without excusing crimes. Would a male noble who committed similar atrocities face the same level of historical infamy? How did gender influence both her alleged crimes and their prosecution? These questions complicate simplistic narratives while maintaining focus on documented harm. The persistence of Báthory in popular culture, from horror films to heavy metal songs, demonstrates our continued fascination with extreme evil. This cultural presence keeps her story alive, but often obscures historical reality with sensationalism. Each generation must decide how to balance engaging narrative with respectful truth-telling. For historians, the Báthory case exemplifies the challenges of reconstructing truth from biased sources. Court records reflect political agendas, witness testimonies were extracted through torture, and later accounts added fictional elements. Yet through careful analysis, patterns emerge that suggest substantial truth beneath the embellishments. The relevance to contemporary discussions of privilege and justice remains striking. When we debate accountability for the powerful, when we examine how institutions enable abuse, when we ask why victims aren't believed, we engage with issues central to the Báthory case. History here serves not as distant curiosity, but as mirror for ongoing struggles. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson from Castle Čachtice is how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil. Servants who initially recoiled at violence gradually became participants. Officials who should have investigated instead accepted bribes. Communities that knew something was wrong remained silent. This gradual normalization of horror warns against assuming we would act differently. The ultimate question posed by Elizabeth Báthory's story is not whether one individual was evil. History provides ample evidence of human cruelty. The crucial question is how societies create or prevent conditions that allow such evil to flourish. Every system that concentrates power without accountability, that creates disposable classes of people, that values order over justice, contains the seeds of its own Castle Čachtice. As we close this dark chapter of history, we're left with an echo that resonates across centuries. The screams from Castle Čachtice were not just the cries of tortured girls, but warnings about what happens when power operates without conscience. When law serves privilege rather than justice, when human beings become commodities for those who consider themselves above judgment. Those screams still echo today, asking whether we've learned their lessons or merely found new ways to silence them.